Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Cavness HR Daniella Young weekly live stream. On this live stream, once a week, we do a deep dive into a topic that has to do with culture. Culture, very broad term. And usually what I do is I write about a topic of something interesting that is happening in the world, that is going on in our society, or that I've encountered during the last week that I think can pour some more thought into, have some so whats, have some takeaways, and have some ideas that are interesting for people to develop, whether for themselves, for their businesses, and all of that included. So feel free to follow me, and I'll talk more about how you can do all of that at the end. Today, we are going to talk about brainwashing. And not just brainwashing, but socialization, how we think the way we think, why we think the way we think, and what specifically we can do to avoid that. Okay, so if you followed me on social media, you know that I have this crazy origin story. I grew up in what I like to call one of the worst religious cults in history for a lot of reasons. My family was in the leadership of this cult for generations, and I got away from this as a young teenager and came to America, ended up commissioning into the Army, doing a career as a military intelligence officer, and now I do culture. I'm a cultural critic. I'm writing books. I'm doing speaking, and I just like to think and delve very deeply into why we think the way we think. And not to mention how to help corporations, businesses, and business leaders develop culture for their organizations on purpose and with deliberation and with a lot of criticism. So my entire thing is we need to expose the cultures that we have to even begin to start building the cultures that we want. And so okay, so why does all this matter? So this matters because I've been out of a cult for, I think, 15, 16 years now, since I was 15 years old. And I get asked all the time, and have over the past almost 2 decades, like, Daniella, why are you not more brainwashed? I even talked about this in my TED Talk, which you can check out on YouTube. And, you know, one of my answers off the cuff is always, well, I'm not more brainwashed because it's been 16 years. Like, if you'd seen me 16 years ago, I was pretty freaking brainwashed. But recently I've been digging into a lot of this more. I'm working on a book. I'm working on a memoir. Hopefully we have some very exciting news about that next year. But it's all about how we become cultured, how we become uncultured, and how everything around us impacts who we are. But I also think there's this interesting idea that's sort of like dangerous with this idea of brainwashing, okay? And then it prevents us from realizing how we can be deliberate about our socialization and our thoughts and how we interact with them, which of course then ends up impacting everything about our culture all around us. And the danger is that there's this sci-fi idea that proliferates, that makes us think that brainwashing is not real. So let's get into it. And in fact, brainwashing is not real. Brainwashing is a concept that was invented in the 1950s when the Korean War was going on and a bunch of Americans got kidnapped and isolated by the Chinese. And then a bunch of those decided to defect to communism. They didn't want to come back to the US. They were completely into China. And this was when the idea of brainwashing as a thing was born. And, you know, movies like The Manchurian Candidate and like The Ipcress File made this popular. Brainwashing then even gained more fame as a term in the 70s with all of the cults, which is, of course, where I come into the picture. And what happens with prisoners of war, and what happens with cults, and what happens with anyone in any kind of isolated thought control environment is extreme socialization. So sure, we can call that brainwashing, but this idea of brainwashing as it's proliferated and grown in popular culture and in sci-fi, where a robot or a Jedi passes his hand over someone and they are just glazed and brainwashed. I find that to be harmful. And I specifically find that to be harmful because growing up as a cult child, the first rule of cults is you're not a cult. And the first rule of being a cult child is we're not brainwashed, we're not abused. And the adults that ran this organization were able to specifically use the popular idea of brainwashing to their advantage as I was always me, like this, bubbly, well-spoken, outgoing, smart. And you can present this 5-year-old child who can read, who can quote the Bible, who seems happy, who's bubbly and smiley, and say, obviously this child is not being abused, is not being thought controlled, is not being brainwashed, and the world will nod their head and agree with you. And that is a little bit of that same attitude that is constantly proliferated when people do say to me today, oh my God, Daniella, you don't seem brainwashed. Well, I was extremely socialized in an extremist religion, and I still am today a product of how I was socialized. Everyone is. And I say that as someone that has spent my life unsocializing myself and trying to focus on understanding why I think the way I do. And I'm still constantly surprised by the various ways that the way that I grew up impacted me. And no matter what I do, and no matter how much I study, I'm never going to be able to go back and have kind of like a normal childhood and normal experiences. So of course, my worldview is always going to be influenced by what I've been through. There's a part of me that's always going to be a little cult girl. There's a part of me that is always going to be an American soldier, because that, of course, is another huge influencing factor in my life. And I think for all of us, when we look at the way we think, if we're thinking, oh no, I'm not brainwashed because I don't look like a robot, because I'm smart, because I am intelligent, that's a huge part of why we can't see the extremism that is going on in our world today, that is impacting us in politics, and that with the advent of technology is becoming more and more and more isolated. So let's talk about the technology part of brainwashing. In President Obama's official farewell to the nation, he talked about this. I'm not sure how many of you remember, but essentially, technology is a great gift and it has done great things. And it's literally also contributed to both sides of this equation. On the plus side, it has opened up the whole world. When I had my new little baby, I was surprised when talking to older generations, our parents and grandparents, when they were raising kids, the only thing they knew was what the people around them knew and what experts had written in books. Everything else was just figured out. Now I can get on the internet and talk to someone in China about how they're raising their child, or anywhere else in the world. And I can pick and choose what elements I want to use. So in one way, the world has become much more open, and our thoughts have become much more open, and our socialization has become much more open. But in another way, artificial intelligence is making us siloed, whether we want to or not, and none of us have agreed to it, but it is happening. And that is what President Obama addressed in his farewell to the nation, as everyone, of course, was in shock, whether they were for it or against the 2016 election. No one expected that outcome, almost no one. So most people were in shock, and most people were wondering what happened. And Obama talks about this, that it has become safer to retreat into our own bubbles, our own neighborhoods, college campuses, or social media feeds. And those social media feeds are siloed because AI is only showing you things that you like. And this is contributing to the rise of naked partisanship and increasing economic and regional stratification. Some amazing, amazing quotes. Please check out my blog post that goes along with this to read the whole quote. This is really important stuff to think about. So, why does this all matter? And of course, I hope that's obvious, but let's spell it out. And part of why it matters is that, look, socialization happens to all of us. We are all affected by what we're exposed to. Everyone has stereotypes. It's humanly impossible to not have stereotypes. That's the way that scientifically our brains work. And so the only way to counteract that is to intentionally socialize yourself very broadly in very different ways. Another quote from President Obama in this same speech is, understand that democracy does not require uniformity. Our founders argued, they quarreled, and they eventually compromised. They expected us to do the same, but they knew that democracy does require a basic sense of solidarity. That idea, for all our outward differences, we're all in this together. We all rise and fall as one. And I love that idea. And thinking about this a lot, and the answer to the question that I get asked of how I am so not brainwashed or how I unbrainwashed myself. And the simple, bare basics answer is I read. I read a lot. I have recently estimated that I've read about 3,000 books in the past 15 years. And I didn't know I was setting out to unbrainwash myself. I just knew that I'd been starved for reading. I wasn't allowed to read anything that wasn't the King James Version of the Bible or the literature written by our prophet. And so I needed to fix that. And I read, senior year of high school, I read 250 books, and it was literally like murder mysteries and Nora Roberts. Nothing that I would ever think was worth reading again. But that's an important part of opening your mind and broadening your perspective. I also, when I was in college, I majored in literature, and that's where I learned to read and analyze everything. And I also learned this very important thing about, there's a reason we call it literary tradition. And that's because ideas can only be analyzed once they're out of your head and written down, and other people are talking and thinking about them. And then ideas all build on other ideas. So that same concept of no woman, man, or child is an island, that is true in books, in reading, in ideas, in everything that we do. And so it was interesting. I commissioned into the military, and in the Army, there was this unwritten rule, especially for officers. And it's unwritten, but it's not unspoken. It is very much spoken that as an officer, you are a military professional and you don't read anything that isn't military related. And this idea, from the very beginning, just creeped me out. I had to do it for basic training. I was the only person that knew that if I brought military books to basic training, they would let me keep my books, which was great. Side books and basic training. And I read all these interesting military books. But as soon as I was released from that, I was like, look, I'm still going to read the military biographies. I'm still taking my profession seriously, but I'm still reading fiction. No one's telling me what to read and what not to read. And I didn't realize why it made me so uncomfortable until I finally did realize that that idea is very cult isolationist thought police thinking. Anytime you're limiting what somebody should be reading, that's no bueno. Okay, so then I get to my first unit. I'm this brand new lieutenant. I'm very wide-eyed and sort of freaked out, and I don't know the world I'm operating in yet. And my boss, the senior military intelligence officer for this brigade, which is a company of 3,000 people, he asked me what I like to read. And I was deer in the headlights. I was so scared. I was do I lie? What do I say? And so I just finally told him, I said, I like to read everything and everything. I love to read memoir. I love to read fiction. I love to read whatever catches my interest. And he, broke out in this really big smile. And he told me that he expects his officers to read fiction, and he's going to rate us, grade us accordingly. Because as military intelligence officers, we're supposed to be the expert on the bad guy. We're supposed to be the people that understand how the enemy thinks. And if you really boil down this concept, the enemy is someone who thinks so differently from you that they're willing to kill you for it. And so it's actually very, very difficult to try to understand what your enemy thinks. And so if your mind is not open, if you are not constantly working out and exercising your imagination by reading all kinds of things, then of course you're not going to be able to predict it. In intelligence, and I've talked about this on other podcasts and other articles, but we are very, very aware that we don't know what we don't know. And you know what? Pearl Harbor and the attacks of 9/11 were both impossible until they happened. And so reading a lot was so important to literally thought development. Like it just is. There's no way around it. This year was pretty cool because I am working on the concept of my own memoir, and not the concept, I'm writing my own memoir, guys. It's hopefully going to sell next year. And so I concentrated on reading and tracking 60 books, which is like, of course, was made famous by Bill Gates, who I've since found out reads a bazillion words a minute. Reading 60 books is exhausting. I've done it, and I'm actually going to surpass it because I'm not just going to stop reading because it's December 10th, but exhausting. And thanks to technology and Audible, helped me out with that. But, and this is part of my mission to develop memoir, develop my book, develop my ideas, but also I really focused on memoirs of historically marginalized voices. So women, LGBTQ plus community, people of color, a lot of different things as a way to like open my own eyes and address my own blind spots and socialization. And it was really cool and really fun. And I didn't like make a reading list. I do use Goodreads so that when I see a book that I want to read, but I don't have time for it, I can add that to my like sometime in the future reading list. But mostly it's just like, once you start paying attention to what you're reading and actively pursuing ideas, like you will always have a million books that you need to read next. And I like it that way. Just like I like to do my professional writing and thinking this way, like what happened? What am I thinking about right now? And what can I pursue to go develop this idea further? So for my handy dandy weekly list that I like to give you, how do you counteract socialization or brainwashing, if you will, in 5 steps? Okay, the first is be suspicious of anyone or any organization that tries to limit what you read. Anything. Your pastor tells you like this book is bad and don't read it, be suspicious of that. Your boss, your spouse, anyone or anything. There is a reason that we consider book burning as a sign of totalitarian rule. And you know what, whether someone is giving you a good reason or a bad reason for telling you why you shouldn't read something, it always has a bad outcome historically, always. Anyone trying to control what you read, like that is thought police. Don't go for it. Okay, step number 2 is read broadly, which of course I've said before in this video. Everything you read doesn't have to have business value, doesn't have to be serious. I've learned this year that comedians are some of the most amazing cultural critics ever. And I'm concentrating on reading and watching a lot of comedy because it's helping me to develop my idea. I found that graphic novels or even kids' books can be such great tools for developing complex thought. By the way, if you're one of those people that is wondering like why we got to where we are culturally, go back and look at children's books and really think about how messed up almost every single story that our classic children's books is. And you'll kind of start to realize why our culture is a little shady. Talk to other people about things that you read. I do this all the time, man. I read a book, it breaks open my brain. If you guys watched my last week's on white fragility, that was one of them. And I have to talk about it to people, and I have to talk about it to people that don't agree because I want to challenge these ideas and beat them up and learn more. Number 4, I definitely recommend track the books that you read because like while you don't need to have a book list and go down your book list and read it, it's still important to ensure that you are in fact reading broadly. And the thing is, like, we still live in a world where, first of all, you can only read books that you know exist because you don't know what you don't know. And you only find out that books exist because of media, because of technology, or because of who you surround yourself with that tells you about them. And so we're still in a world that is sort of white, male, heterosexual, cisgender dominated. And so if you don't go out of your way to find other books, other genres, other ideas, push your boundaries, you are going to end up still, even though you're reading a lot, you're still going to be reading narrowly unless you do this with intention. And trust me, I know I'm reading a book about Melania Trump right now, which is not normal for me and is great thought development for me. Um, and then the last and final step is hold nothing sacred. Again, literally nothing. The moment we refuse to question any idea, any belief, or any superstition, that's the moment that it begins to have outsized power over us. And check out retired General Stanley McChrystal's book, Leaders, Myth, and Reality. You can also check out my book review on it on the Cavness HR blog, or my live stream that I did about it. But he really spends a lot of time where he's like analyzing and studying the actual leadership and the actual choices of these historic leaders that he has thought that he studied and emulated his whole life. But learning that, like, really we need to sometimes literally take these statues off of pedestals, take these portraits off the wall, and really start to examine what actually happened, who these people actually were. And when something is sacred, when something is all important, you can't think about it. You can't analyze it. We've got to crash those pedestals down. We've got to take ideas off of those pedestals. Ideas need to be beat up and exercised and worked. And you know what? Don't worry. If your idea is valid, it can stand up to scrutiny. History has proven this. In conclusion, remember, nobody's perfect, nobody's completely woke, and we're all influenced by the culture and the behaviors and the ideas and the people that we surround ourselves with. Nobody's an island. The best we can do is constantly and deliberately strive to unbrainwash ourselves. Thank you so much for watching. This was Weekly Livestream. I am Daniella Mestenek-Young, TEDx speaker, author, and culture critic. I am with this awesome company called Cavness HR, which is all about doing virtual HR for small companies, getting them hours recovered in their business, but also doing the new HR, doing HR for people, treating HR like human resources. So if you're interested in finding out more about how to build a culture strategy, how to build a leadership development program, or how to do HR from a human perspective, but so that it also benefits your business, please go to www.cavnesshr.com. Contact us today. You can also find me at DanielaMestenekYoung.com. You can connect with me on LinkedIn and on Twitter. And all of that information is available on www.cavnesshrblog.com. Thanks, and remember to be great today.